Motorola spent $5 billion building a phone network that was already obsolete when it launched. In 1998, the company switched on Iridium, a system of 66 satellites orbiting the Earth, built for one purpose: let anyone call anyone from anywhere on the planet, even the middle of an ocean. 11 weeks after Iridium went live commercially, it filed for bankruptcy. The satellites worked, the calls connected, the engineering promise came true exactly as designed. And it still collapsed, because the business case underneath it had quietly died years before the first satellite ever reached orbit. This is one of the more expensive lessons in corporate history, and it's not really a story about satellites. It's a story about time. Specifically, what happens to your core assumptions while you're busy executing a plan that takes far longer than you expected. And it's worth studying precisely because nothing about it looks like the failures managers are trained to watch for. Nobody missed a deadline. Nobody blew the budget in some scandalous way. The team hit its milestones. That's what makes this case genuinely useful instead of just another cautionary tale about incompetence. Because incompetence is not what happened here. Start at the beginning. Motorola began planning Iridium in the mid-1980s. At that time, the idea made complete sense. Cell phone coverage in the mid-1980s was spotty, patchy, missing across huge stretches of the world. If you wanted a phone that worked anywhere, cellular towers weren't going to get you there for a long time, if ever, in remote regions. A satellite network looked like the obvious next leap. Skip the towers. Skip the years of regional build-out. Beam the signal straight down from orbit and cover the entire planet in one shot. Motorola's engineers weren't wrong about the technology. They were solving a real problem with a real gap in the market. Internally, the pitch would have been easy to sell. No competitor could match a system that guaranteed coverage everywhere, including oceans, deserts, and mountain ranges where cellular towers would never be economical to build. On paper, in the mid-1980s, that was a genuinely defensible bet. But building 66 satellites, launching them into orbit, and constructing a global ground network to support them wasn't a 2-year project. It took well over a decade, moving from planning in the mid-1980s to commercial launch in 1998. And during that decade, the world Motorola was building for kept moving. Every year Iridium spent in development, terrestrial cell networks expanded further. Towers went up in cities. Coverage spread across regions. Regulatory approvals for cellular build-out moved faster in country after country than anyone modeling the market in the 1980s had assumed they would. The exact gap Iridium was designed to fill, no cellular coverage in most of the world, started closing years before Iridium had a single paying customer. Nobody made a single bad decision that caused this. It was the accumulation of thousands of small, reasonable decisions made by other companies, in other industries, that collectively eroded the premise Motorola had built an entire venture on. This is the part worth sitting with, because it's the actual mechanism behind the failure, and it shows up constantly outside the satellite phone business. When you commit to a long build, you're not just committing engineering hours. You're making an implicit bet that your founding assumption will still be true when you finally ship. Iridium's founding assumption was that terrestrial cell coverage would remain too limited to compete with satellite calling. That assumption was accurate in the mid-1980s. It was aging badly by the early 1990s. And by 1998, when Iridium finally launched, it was flatly false in every market that actually mattered, the cities and regions where paying customers lived and worked. The assumption didn't fail all at once. It decayed gradually, a little more every year, invisibly, while the project's internal metrics, engineering milestones hit, satellites launched on schedule, kept looking healthy the entire time. By the time Iridium launched in 1998, the mismatch was stark. The satellite handsets were bulky, expensive, and needed a clear line of sight to the sky to get a signal. Walk into a building, into a car, under a bit of tree cover, and the call dropped. Meanwhile, a normal cell phone, small enough to fit in a pocket, worked indoors, worked in cities, and did almost everything Iridium promised, for a fraction of the cost. Iridium had built a genuinely impressive piece of engineering to solve a problem that terrestrial networks were quietly solving in parallel, cheaper, faster, and with far better everyday usability. The irony is almost total. The one place satellite coverage still had a real edge remote regions with no towers at all, was a tiny fraction of the paying market Iridium needed to hit $5 billion in returns. Ships at sea, remote expeditions, disaster zones, that's a real niche. But it was never going to fund a $5 billion global satellite network on its own, and everyone involved in the original 1980s planning had every reason to expect a much larger market by launch day. Here's the part nobody expects when they first hear this story. Iridium didn't fail because Motorola executed badly. By most accounts, the technical execution was close to flawless. 66 satellites is not a small engineering feat, and getting all of them into working orbit, functioning as a coordinated network, on schedule, is the kind of achievement most aerospace programs would call a triumph. The network functioned as designed. If you graded this project purely on whether the team built what they set out to build, it's a success story. The failure lived entirely in a different place. Nobody with the authority to stop or redirect the project sat down at regular intervals across that decade-plus build and asked whether the original premise was still true. The team kept executing against a target that had already moved, and executed it well, which in some ways makes the outcome more painful, not less. And that's really the one piece of original insight worth pulling out of this whole case. Most postmortems on failed long-horizon projects focus on execution, timelines, budget overruns, technical setbacks, because those are the visible, measurable failure points people can point to in a report. Iridium's postmortem has to focus somewhere else entirely, on an assumption nobody rechecked, which is a much harder failure to catch in real time because nothing visibly goes wrong until the day it's too late to fix. There's no red flag on a project dashboard for the market quietly moving. You have to go looking for that signal on purpose, because it will never show up as a missed deadline. This pattern isn't unique to satellite phones. It shows up anywhere a project takes years to ship into a market that doesn't sit still. Take a multi-year software rewrite. A company decides its aging platform needs to be rebuilt from scratch. A clean architecture, better performance, features the old system can't support. Leadership signs off on an 18-month, sometimes 3-year, rebuild, and the team is pulled off feature work to focus entirely on the new foundation. Engineering gets to work. 18 months in, half the original feature list is done. 3 years in, the rewrite finally ships, but the market the original plan was built for has moved. Competitors shipped incremental improvements the whole time the rewrite team was heads down and unable to respond. Customer expectations shifted toward capabilities nobody scoped for at the start because those capabilities didn't exist yet when the rewrite was planned. The rewrite launches technically sound and strategically late, solving yesterday's competitive gap instead of today's. Worse, because so much capital and time is already sunk into it, the natural response is to keep pushing the same rewrite rather than question whether it still targets the right problem. The team executed the plan well. The plan was built for a market that no longer exists in that form. Or take a physical retail expansion. A retailer looks at its growth numbers, decides the winning move is opening dozens of new physical stores, locks in leases, builds out construction plans, and commits capital over a multi-year rollout. The initial assumption, built on the sales data available at planning time, is that foot traffic and in-store buying will keep growing along the same curve it had been on for years. But retail expansion plans, by their nature, take years to execute. Site selection, permitting, construction, hiring, and training staff for dozens of locations at once. During those years, online buying habits can accelerate faster than anyone modeled, especially once a shift crosses a tipping point nobody flagged as imminent when the leases were first signed. The stores open on schedule, built well, staffed properly, into a shopping pattern that has already started moving elsewhere. Nobody in the finance department was negligent, and nobody in construction missed a deadline. The assumption made at the start of a 4-year build-out simply stopped matching reality by year 3, and the leases were already signed by the time anyone noticed. Or take industrial procurement. A manufacturer needs new production equipment, so it commits to a long lead time order, custom machinery, built to spec, with a multi-year delivery window, because that's simply how long the equipment takes to build from the manufacturer's side. The specification is locked at the time of order, based on the production requirements known then, and changing it mid-build is expensive or sometimes contractually impossible. By the time the equipment finally arrives, the product line it was built for has changed, or a newer, cheaper class of equipment has entered the market in the interim, doing the same job faster and at lower cost per unit. The company installs machinery that is functional, correctly built to the original spec, and already behind the market it was meant to serve, sometimes needing a second, faster procurement cycle, just to stay competitive with what it just finished installing. Different industries, same shape. A long build time, locked in against a founding assumption, and a market that keeps moving the entire time nobody's watching it. Notice what all three of those scenarios share with Iridium. In each one, the team closest to the work was doing everything right by the metrics they were handed. The software engineers hit their sprint goals. The retail team opened stores on budget and on time. The procurement team got a fair price on a well-built machine. None of them were positioned, by their role or their incentives, to ask the one question that actually mattered. Has the world changed since we decided this was worth doing? That question doesn't belong to the people executing the plan. It belongs to whoever owns the plan itself, and it only gets asked if someone builds a mechanism that forces it onto the calendar because left to instinct, it never surfaces on its own until the losses are already booked. So what actually fixes this? The instinct is to say, move faster, but that's not always available. Some builds genuinely take years. Satellites take years. Factories take years. Platform rewrites take years. Speed isn't always the lever you get to pull, no matter how much pressure leadership applies to the timeline. The lever that is almost always available, regardless of industry or build time, is a scheduled, structural habit. Revisit your founding assumption on a fixed cadence, separately from your execution timeline. Not, are we on schedule? That's the wrong question to lean on by itself. A different question entirely. Is the thing we assumed about the world when we started this still true right now, today, given everything that's changed since? In practice, this means building a checkpoint into a long project that isn't a status update. It's a premise audit, and it should be treated as a distinct meeting with a distinct owner, not folded into a regular progress review where it will always lose to schedule and budget talk. Every 6 months, say, on a 3-year build, someone senior enough to actually redirect or kill the project sits down and asks specifically what the team believed about the market, the competition, or the customer when the project was greenlit, and whether that belief has held up against current evidence. Not are we behind? A completely different question. Is the destination still worth reaching at all? For a project like Iridium, that would have meant periodically remeasuring terrestrial cell coverage growth against the original 1980s baseline and treating a shrinking addressable market as a 5-alarm signal worth escalating to the board, not a footnote buried in a quarterly review. For a software rewrite, it means checking competitor releases and customer requests against the original rewrite scope every quarter, not just tracking sprint velocity. For a retail build-out, it means watching e-commerce adoption curves against the original foot traffic model before signing the next batch of leases, not just watching whether the current stores open on time. For equipment procurement, it means revalidating the spec against current production needs at the midpoint of a multi-year order, with a real option to amend the order, not just tracking delivery dates and hoping the spec still fits when the crates arrive. The reason this is hard is that execution metrics are satisfying and assumption checks are uncomfortable. A status update that says on track, on budget, feels like progress, and everyone in the room can nod along to it. A premise audit that says the market this was built for might not exist anymore feels like an attack on the project, and often on the people who championed it in the first place, which makes it politically costly to raise even when the evidence is sitting right there. That discomfort is exactly why most organizations skip this step, and exactly why it's the step that would have saved Iridium $5 billion and 11 weeks of watching a technically successful launch collapse into bankruptcy anyway. One caution worth adding here, so this doesn't get taken too far. A premise audit is not permission to abandon every hard project the moment conditions get uncomfortable. Plenty of long builds face temporary headwinds and are still the right call to finish. The point isn't nervousness. The point is a specific, scheduled, evidence-based question asked by someone senior enough to act on the answer about whether the core premise has moved, not whether the project has gotten harder. Those are different questions, and conflating them is how some organizations swing from never questioning anything to questioning everything, which is its own failure mode. Here's the practical takeaway. If you're running or working on a project with a multi-year build time, don't just track whether you're on schedule. Put a recurring, calendared checkpoint on the calendar whose only job is to retest the founding assumption against the current state of the world, not the state of the world when you started. Give that checkpoint an owner senior enough to redirect or kill the project and give it real evidence to look at: competitor moves, adoption curves, customer behavior, not just internal progress reports. Engineering excellence will not save a project whose core premise quietly expired somewhere in year 2. Catching that early is cheaper than any amount of flawless execution after the fact. Follow for more theories that actually explain your workplace.